Evening, everyone, and welcome to our Open News meeting. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor of Tortoise, and I know that my colleague Patricia has noticed that I'm not always the most punctual of editors. So thank you very much for your patience and waiting for me this evening. It's very good to see everyone in what is, in many ways, one of the more difficult weeks to be any kind of journalist, not least a journalist in a slow newsroom. Not because things are moving so fast, but because I think if you get into a life in journalism, part of your thinking is that when things are revealed, the natural consequence is that as a result of those revelations, stuff happens, things change. And everyone, I suppose, gets left a little bewildered if it's the case that things don't. And I say that not just with regard to the Sue Gray report, although I suspect we're going to want to talk to that. I suppose I'm going to say that with regard to the amount of ink that's been spilt and thinking done around levelling up. And I guess we're going to want to do that too. But when we started our thinkings, we used to always kick off with a short spiel by me, which was essentially saying, look, it's an open news meeting. We want to make sure that people come in, share their points of view, bring ideas, make it a place for civilized disagreement, so test what those ideas are. And one of the ways that we used to do that was to ask two questions at the start. And it was quite fun. Obviously, when we were in the newsroom, we could do it quite easily because you say, look, just raise your hands. And we didn't have anything as newfangled as Zoom. But I'd like to just start tonight's thinking by asking ourselves as a group of journalists and members and people who are interested in what's happening in the world, two questions. The first one is, has the government got it right? Is levelling up Britain's most pressing priority? If you think it is, will you just go to reactions and ideally not pop the cornetto cracker, but just raise your hand? So if you think it is, yes, Britain's most pressing priority, raise your hand. Louise, Mark says yes, Chris says yes. It was quite a small. Oh, wow, that's interesting. That's coming along. Oh, I see there are quite a few people who think that. All right, I'm going to just pause for a second. Chris, from your alpine fastness, I'm imagining, where are you, Chris? There you are. Just can you explain why you think that?
Because I think there is a difference between the way that people look at London and they look at the rest of the country. And as somebody who lives, in the north, I've always, I love London. I go to London regularly, and I do love it. But I always think to myself, I want to bring some of it back into where I live. And it seems hard to do that unless you've got the kind of investment and support that London sometimes seems to get.
Okay, thank you. Maggie, Maggie Brown's here, and by the way, I should just say Maggie's covered a beat that I covered for a while, but way better. Yeah. You didn't say that, Maggie. You didn't put your thumbs up to levelling up, and given the media has been under such pressure to move, first it was the BBC to Salford, recently it's been Channel 4 Leeds. Do you not basically buy into that agenda? Do you not think?
Oh, I do. James, I do for Channel 4, and I spoke about this, last month. Yeah. I very much think it is a good idea, although I think it's hard on Channel 4 to do it in the political climate that, it's now having its entrails re-examined all over again. And I also live quite a lot of the time in Wales, in the border region, not so far away from Owen Patterson's former kind of reign, you might say. No, I'm more concerned, to be honest with you, about how we reintegrate with Europe, if you like. I'm afraid I was a complete Remainer, and I feel that we haven't really got our relationship reset with Europe, and I feel that that is incredibly important. I mean, one of the things I do know about a bit is things like Welsh farming, and I think policies that are being affected by the sort of brutality of Brexit include all sorts of casualties, and most certainly farming is one of those as well. But more broadly, it's not that I don't think that there should be investment and there should be a levelling up. I think that that almost comes with being a nation. And I know that we have ignored it. And I know that there are issues of how we now proceed as whether we're a United Kingdom or not. But I'm more worried about the economy, the impact on almost all of us by rising prices, problems with supply and demand, and just the sense that we've detached ourselves from the biggest, most prosperous trading bloc. And that, to me, long term, is what concerns me most of all.
Okay, Maggie, thank you. And Chris, thank you. What I'm gonna do, if it's all right, is I'm gonna come back to this. I think actually in the first half, the mix of kind of UK politics and policy is our subject. But I want to just flag one other thing and ask one other question before we get started, which I don't know whether people have read either what George Packer wrote in The Atlantic this week, an extraordinary piece on the frustrations, I mean, putting it mildly, of Afghan citizens who helped people, this is in the US, and then found themselves essentially barred not just by the bureaucracy that Trump had put in place, but then curiously enough by the Biden administration and people who ostensibly would be kind of card-carrying humanitarians. And if you hadn't read that piece, you might well have read Christina Lamb in the Sunday Times reporting on things that you just think, on the face of it, can't be true, but it appears are the stories of people who are in such dire straits in Afghanistan, are selling their children for food. We reported that, my colleague Paul Carolina Galizzi reported in The Sense Maker, and I actually fretted that that was one of those exaggerations that's just not true. And then the thing that was most frightening to me was that it was actually commonly true. It wasn't an exceptional edge case. It was more than a little true. So I have just a second question before we get started. And I'm really grateful to see Ro here. I'm going to come to Ro in a bit. But I just wonder, in the light of what you've seen in the last 6 to 8 weeks in Afghanistan, do you think that the UK was wrong to withdraw its troops? Not just the manner of its withdrawal, but the actual decision to take troops out of Afghanistan, not to leave a standing force in the country. Do you think that was the wrong decision? Again, can you, I know it's a kind of slightly fiddly business, but yeah, hands up, the wrong decision. Well, that's interesting. I'm just going to ask two people who think that it was the wrong decision, if I might. Charlie Massey, can I ask you why you think that? And I was going to ask Alan Morgenthau as well, if he's still there. Yeah. Charlie, why do you think that?
Why did I think that it was?
It's the wrong decision. I mean, to put it more directly, how long do you think Britain should have kept troops in Afghanistan then?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, it's difficult, isn't it? I feel like trying to think back to how it all happened over the summer and how it really was just an utter sort of domino effect. It didn't feel like it was a planned extraction from the country, and certainly not once it was clear that the Taliban were moving at a pace that apparently hadn't been anticipated. It felt like there should have been an opportunity. There should have been the opportunity taken at that point to reflect and slow the extraction down. And I can't help but feel, maybe I'm just a bit too cynical at the moment, but I can't help but feel that was maybe, if there'd been more people in the office and less on holiday, that might have happened.
My colleague Matt Dancona is here, who, I don't know if you ever listened to Retreat from Kabul, his audio essay on what happened in those 11, 12 days in August.
Yeah.
I will tell you that it's amazing how many people, it turns out, book the whole day at the same time.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a fan of Matt at the moment, I have to say. I thought he was great on Newsnight this week.
He's here. And by the way, it was his birthday 4 days ago, exactly. So there we are. Happy birthday, Matt. For your birthday, we've got you this national mess. We're gonna come to that in a moment. But I just want to get Alan Morgenthau, if you're there, Alan. Are you still there? Yeah, you also were like, keep troops in, but I can't hear you. One sec.
Yeah. Look, it's difficult. I mean, once America made that decision to stay on our own was probably impossible. But, you know, I think it relates back to your other question just before, an entirely different question. I think there is a breakdown happening in society in trust in our politicians. Again and again, one should be able to rely on politicians to make the right decisions on behalf of us. And when you see what's happening right now, I just think everybody is losing trust in government, but also the process. So in that sense, I think it's very regrettable that we got out quite so quickly. But to be honest, once America went, I don't know what else we could have done.
If you get a chance, Alan, to read this, by the way, it's rather intimidating because The Atlantic has this feature, which is it tells you how many words and then how many minutes reading it is. And the George Packer piece is 205 minutes. So, clear, clear the weekend. But when you do read it, actually one of the points that he makes is that the US never really explored what kind of handover there is to NATO, whether there's a role for the EU. So I'd always assume the same, and actually that was the UK's argument. But Packer's quite interesting around not just Biden, but Blinken and John Feiner and Samantha Power and the whole team of people who you thought might have planned for that better. But yeah, I think it definitely, when I read that Christina Lamb's thing, it was just so upsetting. And your kind of sense of, as you say, trust, but also shame. Before I'm a bit impatient, so forgive me. I just want to hear from Ro, because if you are a follower of Tortoise, you'll know that Ro was kind enough to come to one of our think-ins months ago and ended up telling us his story. And then you were kind enough, Ro, to give your time and tell us your whole story in a podcast, The Son of Afghanistan, or A Son of Afghanistan, I should say. And I just wonder how you read what's happening now and what it makes you think is the right thing to have done and done now.
Oh no, I mean, it was, Afghanistan was a self-inflicted failure, as I think about it. It's a tragic one. But the mistake, I think, the crucial mistake that was made is thinking that if we left Afghanistan will kind of, turn into a default position of, peaceful existence of different factions. But it didn't happen because I think at the heart of the Afghan war and the withdrawal was that the Afghan war, in a sense, became very partisan in America. And in the end, no, administration wanted to own it. And every administration was in a haste to end it. And that's why there was no, interest, I suppose, to put a mechanism in place, in a sense, to say, we will be leaving eventually, but we need to live in a way that will be, leaving a sustainable legacy. But the other fault was with the Afghan political elite as well. I think we have to not forget that. They were fantastically corrupt. And, there's a small number of people who got immensely rich without thinking about establishing a state that could sustain itself. And for a long time, they each used the presence of foreign forces as a bargaining chip with which to beat their opponents. And also they used the presence of the international forces to not do anything, to not change their behaviors or their ways of doing business. and that, in a sense, did the undoing of Afghanistan. I suppose the Americans and the West were always going to leave, but the manner in which it was led, we look at it now in the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding there. But if you look at a cost-benefit analysis, remaining in Afghanistan would have cost the West, much, much less, and then then you'll have to deal with the humanitarian crisis that came after. It just doesn't make sense in any level at all.
And I mean, Ro, I think what I'm going to try to do is, firstly, I hope tonight that anyone who's got things that are away from, if you like, the mainstream of the news that we're seeing, whether it's UK politics or Ukraine or Afghanistan, please put a comment in the chat and we'll make sure we come to that. We're going to try and, gather as much string as possible in this hour. But I'd like to come back to Afghanistan a bit. I think we'll do a bit on UK policy and politics first, not least because, Ro, it feels as though we can all agree on the scale of the problem and perhaps even on the mistakes. Much harder are the moral hazards of negotiating with the Taliban, putting in humanitarian efforts that you then need security for, and the potential escalation or re-escalation around that. So I'd like to come back to all of those questions and also to get a sense from you of what you understand is really happening there. But can I go back? This is a kind of, forgive me, we're going round the roundabout a bit here, but go back to where we are today, UK politics and policy. And I'm going to, at our 10:30 meeting, we have a meeting every day at 10:30, and not for the first time, I sort of bullishly lied about my plans for the afternoon, and they were that I was looking forward to reading the Levelling Up paper in full. Of course, I've done nothing of the sort, but Lara and Matt, I'm hoping that you've done the 400 pages so that we don't have to. Lara, why don't you go first? If you were to distill it into a sentence or even just a sound, what does the Levelling Up white paper say?
A bit of everything and also a lot of nothing. But I have to confess that I haven't read the whole thing yet, James, and I will be making my way through much more of it tonight, hopefully. But what's interesting, the first section, so the first 100 pages, which is about where I am a bit further, is that it's basically diagnostics. It's a kind of like big literature review of how we measure things like productivity, pay, etc., what economic geography means, how it's changed, why levelling up kind of, should be a priority. And actually listening to your question about whether or not levelling up is the government priority, I think anybody reading this white paper and the kind of diagnostic challenges that this government sets for itself over the next few years would struggle to disagree with the fact that, seeing as it incorporates basically everything that you can think of within the realms of policies, and in some cases that it should be a government priority. There's a big debate about what's new, what's not new. Obviously, the kind of long-running dispute between, or less dispute, but kind of back and forth between Michael Gove and the Chancellor Rishi Sunak about what funding would be made available seems to have been won by Rishi Sunak, because it doesn't, Michael Gove today has been pressed multiple times on what's actually new in this paper by way of bold funding. And actually, if you read it, there's a lot of kind of reheated stuff from the 2019 manifesto and more recently the spending review around big projects. Things like the net zero money is featuring in the Levelling Up white paper. These are things that I think probably you wouldn't say should necessarily be in here in terms of new and bold government vision. But I think you'd give Michael Gove credit. I mean, a lot of references to Florence's Renaissance, a lot of references to the Industrial Revolution, this kind of big beat by Andy Haldane on what we actually should be thinking of as a vision. I'm finding it quite interesting because these 12 missions that they've set out, the targets for this are 2030, right? The year 2030. And I was talking to Giles about this earlier because we're kind of chewing over how we should be doing it tomorrow. And I think this question about whether Boris Johnson is going to be Prime Minister by 2030, obviously on everybody's lips, but if it's not, and if it's Rishi Sunak, what does that mean for the Levelling Up agenda? And if, judging by his kind of response and conduct in the negotiations, by way of he's clearly resistant to giving multi-year funding to any of these very big projects, I think, given people think he's more of a Lawsonite than into something like big public spending under the kind of Levelling Up objectives, you would think that actually, should Rishi Sunak come in anytime soon, it would put this kind of project, and there are some really lofty goals in here, increasing healthy life expectancy by 2035 being one, increasing R&D and greater outside the greater South southeastern London area by 40% by 2030. You know, if Rishi Sunak comes in and isn't keen on that, I think it's going to be really difficult. But things like local elected mayors, which, you know, everybody on this call I'm sure will have seen something about today. I think 9 million more people will be eligible to be represented by a local mayor by 2030 if all goes to plan. There'll be significant incentives for people going along in applying for that process. Those do look like they're going to make actually probably quite a tangible impact to some people's lives if they can go ahead. And actually the reason I think they've formed such a bulwark of these proposals in the press is that they don't necessarily require tens of billions of pounds in new funding in order to announce it. And regardless of Rishi Sunak's personal preferences, this could be you know, they call it the devolution revolution. It certainly actually is an incredibly kind of big change to the way that politics might operate in this country. So, you know, I mean, I'm still going through it. I'm sorry for those motley thoughts, but
no. Listen, thank you. I mean, you saw Chris liked your phrase, a bit of everything and a lot of nothing. I think that I'm gonna wait to hear what Matt thinks and what Matt makes of it. And Matt, can I get a bog off here? Can you do me what you think of the Levelling Up white paper and where it is at the moment of our politics?
It's, I mean, as Laura said, it's this quite learned, you know, very extremely worthy and erudite document that belongs, somehow you imagine it being read, it should be read in you know, a very statesman-like setting, and yet it's actually been released in this building which is, you know, on fire, blazing joists are falling off, the windows are crashing in, the roof is falling off, the basement is flooded. There's a kind of bathos about it, really. It's very hard to take seriously, I have to say. First of all, because for the reasons Laura set out, that, you know, there is a lot to be said about, is there any new money in it? What does it really amount to? How much political will is there behind it? But the fact of the matter is, it's the backdrop against which it's been released is one of absolute political carnage. 3 more Tory MPs came out against the Prime Minister today. That's the big story. And, you know, every effort by the government to flood the zone, whether it's with the Brexit Freedom Paper or the trip to Ukraine or now this, it's not going to knock the parties off the front page. But the parties are the story.
And Matt, can I just ask you, just, sorry, forgive me, I'm like not as up with my past Tory leadership challenges. When kind of the letters go into the 1922, historically, what happens? Do most of them go in secret and a handful of them are public? Or actually, as it gets more momentum with those in public, you get more and more being seen to put their letters in?
I mean, a bit of both. Obviously, when it's someone like Ian Duncan Smith, they march publicly and, you know, pretty unafraid. When it's a sitting Prime Minister like Theresa May, who survived a confidence vote, it tends to be a bit more secret until the last few go in. My own view actually is it won't be a confidence vote that does for Boris. I think it will be, I think that this is more like the rust has set in, and the question is, at what point does the metal break? And it's very hard to know, but I'm skeptical that there will be a kind of grand leadership. I mean, to slightly counter that, one thing that is being talked about by Johnson loyalists at the moment is that he does do what Major did in 1995, which is say, all right, let's have it, and call a confidence vote himself, which would actually be quite a smart thing to do, because that historically tends to terrify Tories. So that's a slightly different point. But if as it were, we're assuming that. How serious is that?
How serious is that idea, man?
I don't know. I mean, it's only been used the once. I mean, one other kind of version of it was that William Hague balloted the entire Tory membership on his manifesto in, I think, just before 2001. But it's not quite the same. I mean, I can see. Look, I mean, this is a scorched earth Prime Minister. He is not going to go for reasons of honour, dignity, or posterity. He's going to hold. You know, we're going to have to prise his fingers off the door frame of number 10. So if he thinks that, if the whips are telling him, and his sort of shadow whips as well, that he would win a competition like that, and he probably would, then he might well go for it. I mean, all options are on the table, and he's determined. It cannot be exaggerated. He is determined to win this.
I just want to hear from Phoebe, because I didn't see Andy Burnham. What did Andy Burnham? Was Andy Burnham being asked in the Treasury Select Committee directly about levelling up?
Sorry, it was the Transport Select Committee, not the Treasury, but it was on the integrated rail plan. So kind of, you know, relevant discussion to be had at the moment. But I'm just going to make sure I've got this right. So it was Carl McCartney who was kind of running the session. They were talking about the integrated rail plan. Clearly, we know Burnham's quite keen to bring back some of the trains that were cut down because of cost, and he kind of turned to him and said, you know, do you not understand the meaning of the phrase, do not bite the hand that feeds you? Please, sir, can I have some more like Oliver than coming out in public and trying to beat the government up like the Incredible Hulk? Do you think that's delivering for the plan for Manchester? I mean, to be fair, I've not seen Andy Burnham, but quite so, excuse me, came back and said, you know, how about we get what we were promised? He promised that we were going to have this set up. And from what he was saying, he didn't think that a good levelling up kind of plan had been put in place for the impact of kind of reducing HS2. And, you know, clearly HS2 is complicated, but I think it was interesting to see that kind of happening on one side, and I had the levelling up paper on the other side, and I didn't quite see how the two matched up. So I'll drop a link in the chat to the Yorkshire Post report.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see that. I've got, by the way, I saw Alan Morgenthau's point about, you know, massive losses in the May elections. Just one thing to point out, and I don't know, I think, Matt, you may have heard the same thing too, which is that the Tories don't quite know what to make of what's coming in the May local elections. Because on the one hand, if all the pundits count the national vote when it comes in, it's going to look pretty bad for Johnson. But this happens to be one of those local elections in the cycle where the majority of the seats are not really Tory seats. They're not, you know, there are a lot of them are London. They're not seats that are, you know, real, you know, shire councils. And it was explained to me a bit, the weird thing about council elections is that if you're a constituency MP and 10, 15, 20 odd councillors from your party get voted out of office in the local elections, it gets very toxic very fast. Your own party is very angry with you. If, strangely enough, it's a statistic, right, but it doesn't affect you and your councillors quite so directly, you may be able to see that off. And definitely the kind of calculations that you're hearing from the likes of Linton Crosby are, look at where we are in this cycle. These local elections aren't necessarily as terminal for Johnson as some people are suggesting. I don't know, Matt, do you hear a similar thing?
Well, I mean, ever since this whole sort of imbroglio began, there's been expectation management around May the 2nd, and certainly, yes, it won't be as bad as you think, or what constitutes bad. I think the punditocracy will take the percentage, and run with that. The question really is, against what backdrop does it? You know, if in the unlikely event that everything has gone quiet, it'll be like any other local election night, and most people won't notice it. I don't think that's likely to be the case.
I suspect not. I just want to finish. I'm going to come to Ake and Claude in a moment. But Matt, I just want to have one other question to you, which is, it took me about the whole of last year to figure out what was going on in British politics. And I was really pleased when, come December, I was like, aha, I see what's happened here. The Tories turned left at Brexit. Who would have thought it? And now, after all that hard work, 3 or 4 weeks later, turns out that analysis doesn't hold anymore, because you can't help feeling Rishi Sunak is in charge. There's much more financial prudence. It feels much more conservatively cautious.
I think you're right. I mean, I think the problem is they're both. That it's the Tory party has always been like looking, you know, it's like looking at geological strata, and Rishi Sunak, for all his sort of surface modernity, is the sort of 1980s Thatcherite stratum, or if you like, you know, the fiscal conservatism era, perhaps, of the Cameron Osborne times. But no, you're right. A lot of the people who came in 2019 want money to be spent. And this leads to the point you've been making about, actually, I mean, in a way, this is the core question, the question you've raised, James, about what sort of public finances and what sort of doctrine of public finances do we have? And I think that there's a split in the Conservative Party on this that is absolutely at the heart of politics. So no, I mean, Boris is a very, very bad teacher politician. So he hasn't articulated the beliefs that you identified, and which I think are absolutely right, and represent to some extent that a very viable version of conservatism in the future. But that hasn't gone away. It's just that the person who holds the purse strings at the moment is an absolutely classic, borrowing is evil, tax cuts are great, man who made a great fuss before his last budget of saying that he'd been in close contact with Nigel Lawson. To draw from that what you will.
And I think we should be careful, Matt, of one thing, which is that I suspect that if we were hosting this, a kind of Thinking at Unheard, or even possibly The Spectator, the actual critique you'd get is sort of not Maggie's, oh, you know what, we are not paying attention to our relationship with Europe, or necessarily even Chris's, actually, we need to be thinking about levelling up, look at what's outside. The real, I think, criticism you'll get on the right is, this is a government that doesn't understand the need for growth, that overwhelmingly it's failed on the competitiveness agenda, and it's not doing enough to enable business, animal spirits, etc. And I think that's something that's coming and brewing. You sort of feel it. It's not just around Nix, it's around the whole agenda.
Exactly. So, and also the sort of double promise of Brexit, which was that Brexit will deliver, as you say, a more economically competitive, Singapore on Thames, if you like. Yeah. But also, it would deliver £350 million extra a week to the NHS, which in turn was symbolic of. I mean, that in a way was the birth of levelling up. I know that they're not quite the same, but what that animated in voters and in certain corners of the Tory party was great. There's going to be lots of extra money to spend on the things that non-traditional Tory voters really care about. Everyone cares about the NHS, but that duality remains, and the failure to sort of really get behind growth plays into both those silos.
Can I just, Matt, I just want to bring in Gregory Mulligan if I can, and I'm going to come in a moment to Simon Howson-Green too. Greg, just on the point about the devolution and the cuts in local funding, there are two elements to this, aren't there? There's overall what the decade meant for central funding to local government, and there's a secondary question, which is why this has not done anything to enable local government to have some kind of fundraising, either tax raising or borrowing powers. Are you there, Greg? Can you hear me? You're there? Oh, you're not speaking? You're waving. You're leaving. This is a much better game than we've ever played before. This is, okay, I'm waving you, but I'm then going to go to Simon Howson-Green, who you can do another thing. You can also play charades if you like. Simon, are you speaking? Yes, can we hear you? There you go, far away.
Yes, thank you. Just to go back to a few basics, I think one of the keys here is nothing is going to happen in terms of policy of any substance at all until the Boris Johnson issue is solved. I think one thing that's really interesting at the moment, a few people on this panel will know about this, there are 3 other stories still in the sidelines to brewing. I was actually amazed that...
Sorry, do you know what those stories are?
Yes. Well, I'm not going to... Yes, I do.
What are they?
Well, there is one to do with Carrie. There is one... I really don't want at the moment to say what those 3 stories are, but
okay,
I think it would be inappropriate at the moment. I'm sure there's a few people who will know what at least two of those stories are. I think one of them is very much closely connected with the row today between Priti Patel and the Mayor of London and Number 10 as well, and this is going to be a fairly interesting. This is going to play out as well, but you know, in many ways, I think at the moment, what the most interesting thing we're seeing, and I have so many strands I want to pull up, I'm just going to stick to this one, is the resurgence of Michael Gove at the moment. And I think the one thing I tried to say a couple of weeks ago, but unfortunately I couldn't talk because I was in the bath listening to you, is that, you know, we're now seeing Michael Gove, and we have to remember that Dominic Cummings is Michael Gove's man and has been for 20 years. And a lot of what is happening now is, I believe, part of a very clever, a very strategic and orchestrated move to just establish that Michael Gove is actually probably the best replacement for Boris Johnson. But I think he's waiting at the moment. There are two stories that are going to happen. And just one on that level, I really believed that Sue Gray would offer Boris Johnson a chance to be able to say, look, I haven't been completely vilified by this report. However, I think for the good of the party, I'm going to stand down, because I believe that Johnson probably wants to go. And I think it's disingenuous. It's misguided of us to think that he's going to cling on to power at all levels. I don't think he wants to. I think there are things happening. There are stories out there, two of them particularly, which probably he doesn't want to be in the hot seat when they break.
Simon, just so you know, I mean, the only thing I should say is that I heard that Michael Gove had said about himself in terms of the leadership that he didn't want it, that he wasn't going to go for it.
Oh, well, of course you won't then.
No, I know that, but there was a particular phrase he used, which I wouldn't be surprised you'll hear more frequently, which is Ken Clarke without the likability. And there's a question about whether or not so I just raised that because that's anyway what I've heard.
No, I think we don't want to dominate much more, but I think the really interesting about Gove and Cummings, and they are really a partnership in many ways, but still that's really important, is that really Cummings, who I've not really liked for a very long time, but I'm now beginning to reassess my opinion of him, is really the only brain, admittedly not helping government now, who understands the challenges that we face now. We're dumped in the middle of Brexit. And because we're dumped in the middle of Brexit, because we're becoming isolated, because no longer is COVID something that the government can hide behind to blame for the problems that we face with Brexit, Cummings is probably the visionary who does have a 5-10 year plan, and Gove is the sort of person who probably can articulate that. Rishi Sunak is far too marginalised to do that. Other people who are possibly contenders, they're just not in there. And all the people who are really being critical of Johnson and telling him to go at the moment aren't even in the running to become leader of the party. But there's a lot of people waiting at the moment, and they're waiting. And I think the only way that this government is going to be able to move forward to start putting the levelling up in some sort of place, whatever that levelling up looks like, is when we resolve the Johnson issue. He is he's the what's the word? He's the block. He's the roadblock in getting anything happening at the moment, and that's why he has to go. And I think eventually everybody's going to start in the party's going to start realizing that. Sorry, I've talked too much, but
no, Simon, it's very. I mean, I suspect that many people in the party will feel that way too. I'm not. I have to say personally, I'm not entirely convinced. I'm more in Matt's camp on he doesn't want to go. He'll kind of cling on to the door lintels. I say that because I once heard George Osborne tell a story of having gone to Boris Johnson's country house for the weekend, and apparently it's got a swimming pool. And Boris Johnson's idea of fun was having a tug of war across the swimming pool, Boris Johnson and his kid, George Osborne and his kid, and the winner was the person who pulled the other team into the pool. That was his idea of a good time. We'd pull the other people, they would lose, they'd be pulled in the pool. And so, anyway, this was George Osborne's version of the fact that this guy likes to win. Yeah, go on, Simon, you want to go back?
I was going to say, is that a metaphor? Because if that is a metaphor, I think the point is maybe that's one way that Boris Johnson might want to play games at his country retreat, but of course he probably can't swim.
An extended one. Okay, so Simon, thank you. Sorry, I came in Claude. I kept on saying I'll come back to you, and I saw your hands up just now. Are you weighing in on this, the British politics end of it?
Yes, and I also think we have to face the fact that Rishi Sunak would not be possible or able to become Prime Minister in the fact that he hasn't really done his job as Chancellor. The amount of businesses that have gone into liquidation is really appalling in outcome, and also the fact of that we have publicans who have a mistrust for the actual Conservative Party on a whole, and a mistrust for politics on a whole as well. And I think it's time for really...
Sorry, forgive me for interrupting. But actually, wouldn't Rishi Sunak say, actually, look at the unemployment level, look at youth unemployment and the furlough system overall. Okay, yes, there was a massive assault on the economy because of the pandemic, but actually, he managed to save jobs. Isn't that what he would say to that?
No, not particularly, because the factor is there's still like a lack of investment within education. There's still a lack of investment within businesses that have been brought up for a long period of time. It doesn't take one day to build a business. It takes quite a long period of time. And even particularly for the creative industry, they've suffered and had a really hard, you could say, hit in the fact of not being included. And as a chancellor, he hasn't really done his job to the fullest of what individuals could expect. And I think we have to understand that Dominic Cummings and Dominic Raab are the kind of only ones that, in my view, have common sense and have a head on their shoulders within the government. And I think the reason why they've been treated the way that they have is because when it comes to certain things that are happening and which they are not happy with, they will probably either call it out or either challenge that situation which has happened in government. So, and this is why I think they've been... Sorry,
David, no, I just think, I mean, people are going to have different views on Dominic Cummings and Dominic Raab, but the one thing that I think is really interesting is this issue about investment in education, overall structural investment in the economy, and the thing that we were trying to figure out, and actually I feel like I'm really trying to figure out, is whether or not what we've done, not for the last 2 years in the Johnson government, not even the last decade of Conservative-led government, but for 30, arguably 40 years, is to try to expand the provision of public services, promise more in terms of structural investment, but keep essentially a lid on public spending, and whether or not we've actually come to a moment where we've discovered we can't do any more with what we've got, and we're either going to have to borrow much more, right? Instead of 100% of GDP, 120, 130% of GDP, we're going to change our indebtedness as a country, or we're going to say we're going to change our social contract as a country. We're not going to pretend to ourselves that we can do as much as we once did in terms of either public services or public investment. But it feels to me as though we're considering, yes, I think Lindsay Evans has made the point, is it big versus small state? But Lindsay, I think it's also partly, is it tax or is it borrow or is it do less? Because I think this debt question, and you should never listen to a journalist encouraging high levels of debt. It's arguably a kind of lazy way of thinking about it, but it feels like a big question for us. Akeem McCall, I would come back to you, but forgive me, I do want to come back to this Afghanistan point, and I also do want to just go to Andrew Brown for a second, because heaven knows anyone who's got an interest in talking about anything else is welcome these days. So Andrew, although I've got to admit, it's not the sort of, it's a weird story, this. You've flagged up in the chat the Christchurch story, is that right?
Okay, well, what you have is one of the richest colleges in Oxford. It's got about £500 million in its endowment, enormously well placed socially, and the oddity that the chapel in the college is also the cathedral of the Diocese of Oxford, so that the head of the college is also the dean of the cathedral. It's one of these weird pieces of sort of post-medieval craft establishment that hangs around. And about 4 years ago, they hired a new dean, and he was a guy who thought that he was being hired to get stuff done. This isn't actually the role of the head of an Oxford college, who has no real powers. They're run in law, they're charities, and all of the fellows are trustees. Now, this is a really bad way to run a charity, because it means you've got a governing body of 40, 50, 60, 70 people, And of course, most of them have no interest in this at all. You know, you go to the job because you want to teach medieval English literature, not because you want to faff around deciding how to spend how to spend or invest £500 million. In any case, Martin Percy, the dean, got up the noses of several of his colleagues, and they decided to get rid of him. Trouble is, it's an old college. The constitution, most recently drawn up in the 19th century. Sorry, James, you're making a face.
Yeah,
Shall I go on?
No, I'm making this face, Andrew, which is the one bit of this story which I've still never really understood is what did he do that so upset them? What was the reason for this?
Well, I think essentially it was a matter of character. I mean, I know Martin a bit.
Right.
The technical reason for the blow up was that there was a what do they call it, a pastoral crisis.
Right.
One of the undergraduates there, a woman, got in stabbed her boyfriend in a drunken, drug-fueled, whatever it was, and there was quite a scandal about this sort of Brideshead Revisited stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And Martin said, you know, why is it that there is nobody doing pastoral care in August? How do you all go on holiday and just, you know, dump it on me? And their answer, of course, well, that's the way we've always done it.
Right.
And then there were various rows about salaries, because those he's paid very well for a clergyman, he's paid very badly for the head of an Oxford college, and other things. And essentially, you know, this place had been run by a group of 6 or 7 people who cared about running it, and he got up their noses. They decided to get rid of him. But the Constitution is Victorian. The only way you can get rid of him is by alleging something like grossly immoral or scandalous conduct. So they had
and he didn't meet the threshold for that.
No, he didn't, but they did their very best to drive him out anyway. And there, you know, there are subcurrents, like other people in the chapter of the cathedral rather wanted his job, which, you know, I mean, it is the best paid job in the Church of England, pretty much, and he lives in the most gorgeous house. And they were walking me around the college one evening, and Emma Percy, his wife, I said, "What's that building?" And they said, "Oh, that's the second orangery."
In case you get bored or go, I get uninvited to the first. Can I just ask one thing, Andrew, which is just more broadly, my colleague Ellen and I have been talking about whether or not we have been, and in fact everyone's sort of been missing, a story about a real street fight within the Church of England amongst the most senior clergy. And I wondered, if you were us, how you would think about getting into it.
Well, I had a big row about this with the Times last autumn, because I don't think there is an identifiable row like that. I don't know how you see the story, but as I see it, the problem, there are a group of people at the top who are attempting to run as an organization something which is totally disorganized, and where the funding model is absolutely broken. And they don't know how to do it. Nobody knows how to do it, actually.
Right.
Within that larger picture, I think, I could be wrong, but I think that they are united in a sort of despairing thrashing around.
Okay, good. Well, you know,
I mean, I could explain this at much greater length.
No, well, I think, Andrew, I think we might do that, because I think we might come to it as partly because I'm really fascinated by the character of Justin Welby, but partly because, as you say, the economics of the church and its whole, you know, place in the country are just so interesting. So maybe we'll come back to that. But I want to, in the last 10 minutes, if I can, just come back to Ro, really, because, sorry, Ro, I said I'd come back. Firstly, can you tell us, I don't know how much of your family you get to be in contact with in Afghanistan, so how much you really feel like you've got a sense of what's happening in the country, and particularly as sort of Hazara families. What do you know?
I mean, I'm in constant contact, and the good thing that's happened is, when we talk about Afghanistan's changed, it's the predominantly young Afghans who, Afghanistan is a young country in terms of its population, and everybody in the family or anyone I know had a smartphone. I mean, I've spoken before as well. My uncle, whom I shared a Taliban cell with, and he was being tortured, and we both were. He's illiterate. He can't read he can't read or write, but he's still got a Facebook account. So, we get the constant updates. And the only thing that the Taliban have not been able to do is to curtail people's access to the internet, because it's in their interest to do so.
Yeah.
But because of the, my own visibility in British politics, and I think I always get a text saying, can you just, not, you got to be careful about what you say. Yeah. And so I am in contact with everybody, and probably I just need to drop it here as well. It would be helpful. Is I have been, it's heartbreaking. And it's personal in the sense that I saw my own little brother. He was a baby. When I see the pictures of bloated stomach babies, it reminds me of that dark evening night that I actually tried to help my own little brother. His name was Mohammed. And, I tried to give him his last meal, and he couldn't take it. And he just died within minutes of that. So he died of malnutrition before my eyes. I know the pain that people are going through, and I hear a lot. And one of the things that I've been doing is trying to, get as much support as I can, collect, donations, contributions from friends here, and send over, because of the family relationships that we know people are in need. So we've been able to provide some help, and to date I've been able to help 75 families get through the winter. So if anyone here can help, you can go into my Twitter details and find out. But in terms of, I think that there's an overarching worry in Afghanistan. Everybody I speak to, and the people are coming to terms with what's actually hit them, apart from the hunger, and it's what is actually worrying people the most is come the spring, and what shape the Taliban and anti-Taliban resistance are going to take. And the people who'd fled Afghanistan, remember the tens of thousands of well-trained military forces which just disappeared. They're all being divided. If you follow Afghanistan, you can see this great divide emerging, very ethnic-based divide emerging. And also, you look at the Pashtuns, for example, they're coalescing again around the Taliban and saying they're defending Pashtun identity. So you can see a kind of a deeply tribal, ethnic-based conflict brewing underneath the surface. So even the moderate Pashtuns, for example, who are anti-Taliban, are now coalescing around the Taliban. Blaming non-Pashtuns, 60% of Afghan populations, who talk about decentralizing power in Afghanistan in order to give others a right to be heard, is anti-Pashtun. So you can see, and also, in different parts of Afghanistan, north of Kabul and elsewhere, you see people gathering together, and amid all the snow and the mountainous region, people are still fighting. We have to remember there's still fighting going on, and it's likely to get worse and worse. And
And can you just explain what you would do? I mean, I think lots of people. Will you put the link in the chat, Rose, so the people who want to get involved and support what you're doing can do that easily? But while you're doing that, can I just ask, what would you advise Western governments on this question of a kind of humanitarian assault on Afghanistan, some kind of big humanitarian push? Does that prop up the Taliban, or does that save people's lives? What do you do?
You have to look at Afghanistan and says that the hunger is very difficult in the suburban areas. In villages where people have been growing their own food, it's not as bad. But you look at the way aid is being delivered, and the Taliban have been effectively siphoning aid directly to their own people and the people who are sympathetic to it. And when I just mentioned my own brother dying of hunger, of malnutrition, it was because of the Taliban food blockade on us, the Hazara people.
And sorry, Ro, when and where was that?
It was in 1998, 97, 98. And so
the Taliban are in charge. The Taliban are in charge and trying to essentially squeeze the Hazara communities.
Yeah, so you had the Hazarajat is the central part of Afghanistan where centrists and my dad being a commander, and also it's the stories that the Hazaras were resisting Taliban rule, and they were pretty much circled, and the Taliban had blockaded food getting in. So you had countless people die from 1998 until the 2001 and the 1999 when the whole thing fell apart. And now when we talk about aid, we have to make sure that we understand the way the Taliban are using that power to distribute aid. In places where I talk to, for example, the Hazara areas, people have not heard of aid. And also in places like, for example, in Hazarajat in Daikundi province, Taliban have been taking away aid delivered to the Hazara communities. They've taken them back. And in my own birthplace, people, and you know, I've talked about it before, and one of my uncles died fighting the Taliban just, you know, as the country was collapsing. And as a compensation for that, the Taliban have inflicted a kind of a collective punishment, have taken a large piece of land and given it to the Pashtun neighboring villages. And also they've applied a uniform tax on people to pay because they've been resisting the Taliban. So you can see that, you know, when we talk about aid, we have to make sure that the aid is delivered equitably. But we also have to understand, in order to do that, we have to also understand the fault lines in Afghanistan.
Yeah, so go on. Yeah, go on. Sorry, Rob.
So on that fault line, it is, you know, the Taliban have always been using food as a weapon of war. And it will make sure that deprivation is used against people whom it sees as enemies. So, you know, there are a lot of dynamics moving come the spring and the summer. I think what the West has got to be ready for is the larger civil war conflict. And now what we actually don't pay attention to is, you know, the regional powers who backed the Taliban in order to get the West out. Now the West is completely out of the region. You know, America's out of South and East Asia, South and Central Asia, given the Putin, and Afghanistan, you know, South Central Asia is completely lost, and the West has lost all the influence. And now all the neighboring countries, Iran's, you know, the Central Asian republics, the Russians, the Chinese, who had an interest in supporting the Taliban, now are picking their own separate horses because interests are diverging. And now the other countries are getting ready for what is going to come. And I think yesterday, the Russian special envoy for Afghanistan, his name is instantly Zamir Kabulov. And he said in an interview with the, I think, TASS news agency, that they're expecting not only that terrorists will, you know, the Central Asian linked terrorists will be part of, who are part of the Taliban, will move to Central Asia, but also that the Russians were expecting a large, you know, uprising against the Taliban in different parts of the country, which, you know, the people I talk to is getting more and more momentum. So we don't just have a humanitarian crisis per se of people dying of hunger. We will have a larger crisis of country falling apart and descending into larger, you know, a bigger fire, or, you know.
Well, listen, I'm aware of the time, so I'm gonna cut you short. Though actually, I suspect I, like most people, would just actually rather just like to sit and listen and get a better understanding of what's going on there. I think, Ro, just sort of to wrap things up for this evening, I think that one thing is we should probably just have a session and try and get as many different people along on Afghanistan, not for all of us to weigh in, but just to actually try and get as many different stories. Actually, when we were talking this morning about this, we were trying to think of who's there journalistically, but actually, if, as you say, there are a lot of people are still online, we might be able to figure out a way of bringing them in either directly or in a form that protects their identities. But I think that's obviously a piece of work for us. Andrew Brown, I think we will in some form or another, I was going to say take you up on your offer, but you didn't make an offer. We'll nonetheless try and go ahead and say, yes, okay, go ahead and try and have a look at the church. I think this thing about British politics and levelling up, I suppose I do feel like we as a newsroom started out saying, actually, we didn't think that the politics of left and right made much sense these days. We weren't going to carry water for any political party. There's an agenda which is around, you know, Alan Morgenthau's point, which is trust. There's an agenda, I think, which is around the truth about the impact of Brexit, which I know Maggie mentioned. I know my colleague Charles Woodell, if you notice in the Sense Maker, just keeps on going at. But I think, I don't know what Laura and Matt think, but I think that this question that's left that, you know, Chris mentioned right at the very beginning, which is, how are you going to remake the map? And can you remake the map without a significant investment, without a different kind of structural set of funds available? Feels like it's a question for us. So I think we're going to come back to what you described, Matt, as I think the doctrine of economic conservatism, if there is at the moment such a thing. On that celestial note, I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening. Happy birthday to you, Matt, a little belatedly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And join us. Oh, by the way, sorry, join us tomorrow evening. Liz Mosley's chairing, but Polly Curtis, one of our founding editors at Tortoise, who did that whole series on family separation, how the family courts separate parents from their children, and the transparency, or frankly lack of that, is going to be here talking about what social workers do and what they should do. It should be a really interesting an important night's conversation. So join us at 6:30 tomorrow evening. Good night all. Thanks so much.